When the officers asked if she would come with them to see him, she didn't hesitate, and in the hospital room, surrounded by machines and quiet beeps, Mr. Walter opened his eyes and saw her first. Not the uniforms, not the salutes that followed, and he smiled the same small smile he always did and said, "You're late." And she laughed through tears, placing a folded napkin on his tray like always, and the officers stood frozen, because the man who had never accepted a medal in public reached for the girl's hand as if it were the highest honor he had ever received. And in the days that followed the story spread, but not the way people expected, because Aaliyah refused interviews, saying only that kindness wasn't news, and when Mr. Walter passed quietly a week later, his funeral was attended by hundreds, flags folded with mathematical precision, officers saluting, neighbors crying, and Aaliyah standing beside her mother, holding a brown paper bag with one final breakfast she never got to give, and the twist no one saw coming arrived months later, when a letter came addressed to Aaliyah in handwriting she recognized instantly, explaining that Mr. Walter had quietly set aside a trust using back pay he never touched, instructing that it be used not for monuments or ceremonies but for scholarships in her name for children who practiced service without cameras, and that the officers hadn't come to her door to reward her, but to make sure she understood that what she did every morning had restored something Mr. Walter thought he'd lost forever: faith in the country he served. Not through speeches or symbols, but through a child who believed no one should eat alone, and years later, when Aaliyah herself stood in uniform at a different kind of ceremony, having chosen a path of service inspired not by glory but by breakfast on a cold sidewalk, she would still wake early, fold her napkin just so, and remember the old man who taught her that sometimes the most powerful acts of patriotism happen quietly, daily, and without witnesses, until the day the world finally knocks on your door and asks who you really are. Every morning at exactly 6:10 a.m., before the sun finished stretching its pale fingers over the cracked sidewalks of a forgotten American neighborhood, a 12-year-old black girl named Aaliyah stepped out of a narrow apartment building holding a brown paper bag warm against her chest, her breath fogging the cool air as she walked 3 blocks to the same bus stop bench where an old white man named Mr. Walter sat wrapped in a threadbare coat, his beard yellowed by time, his hands trembling, not from the cold but from memories he never spoke aloud. And she did this every day without fail, rain or shine, school day or weekend, because her mother worked night shifts at a nursing home and taught her that dignity was something you practiced when nobody was watching. So Aaliyah would sit beside him, pull out a biscuit or eggs or oatmeal, sometimes a slice of bacon if her mom had extra tips that week, and say the same words every morning: "Breakfast time, Mr. Walter," and he would smile, like someone had just called his name after decades of silence, thanking her with a voice that sounded like it had been buried under rubble. And at first the neighborhood noticed in the way people notice things they plan to forget, with sideways glances and quiet assumptions, some thinking the girl was being used, others thinking the old man didn't deserve help. But time has a way of sanding down suspicion, and months turned into years, and Aaliyah grew taller while Mr. Walter grew smaller, his stories always circling the edges of something bigger, talking about discipline and early mornings and the smell of oil and metal, about brothers who weren't related by blood but by oath, though he never once said the word military. Never mentioned medals or ranks, only saying once, when Aaliyah asked why he always folded the napkin so neatly, that habits don't leave you even when everything else does, and sometimes when sirens wailed in the distance, he would flinch just slightly, like his body remembered a sound his mind refused to revisit. And Aaliyah, who had learned to read emotions faster than books, learned when to be quiet and when to ask, and the mornings became their own small universe, a ritual untouched by the chaos of the world, until one winter Mr. Walter didn't show up, and Aaliyah waited an hour, then 2. Her fingers numb around the paper bag, panic creeping into her chest, and when he finally appeared he was limping badly, blood seeping through a torn shoe, insisting he had fallen. But Aaliyah saw the bruises that looked like hands, and she said nothing except sit, with a firmness that surprised them both. And from that day on she brought an extra napkin, extra kindness, and a quiet promise she never said aloud, and the neighborhood changed in subtle ways. A coffee appearing beside Mr. Walter one morning, a blanket folded carefully another, until one afternoon Aaliyah came home from school to find 2 men in dark uniforms standing outside her apartment door, their posture rigid, shoes polished to mirrors, and for one terrifying second she thought something had happened to her mother. But instead one of the men removed his cap, holding it against his chest, and asked her name with a voice trained for command but softened by something like awe, and when she nodded, he said they needed to speak with her and her mother about Mr. Walter, and the world seemed to tilt as her mother arrived, fear flooding her face as she listened. Because the men weren't police, they were military officers, and they explained slowly, carefully, that Mr. Walter H. Thompson was not just an old homeless man, but a retired master sergeant who had served in conflicts most history books summarized in a paragraph, that he had been awarded commendations that couldn't be publicly displayed for decades, that he had once led men out of places no one was supposed to survive, and that after losing his wife, his son, and then his sense of place in a country that moved on without him, he had disappeared by choice, rejecting pensions he believed others deserved more, and living quietly where no one saluted him, and what they didn't say at first but what eventually spilled out, was that intelligence had flagged his location only because a charity video filmed by a passerby had gone viral, showing a young black girl feeding an old white man every morning without knowing who he was, and that video had reached men who once followed Mr. Walter into fire, men who owed him their lives, and now they wanted to find him before it was too late, because he had collapsed that morning and been taken to a VA hospital under an alias he had used for years, and Aaliyah felt something inside her break and harden at the same time, because she hadn't fed a hero, she had fed a man, and she didn't know which truth hurt more, and when the officers asked if she would come with them to see him, she didn't hesitate, and in the hospital room, surrounded by machines,